myself in the mics a lot, which is weird. In 114, I can't at all. So welcome to EPICS Professional Development Series. So we'll do, I think it's 4 of these to start the semester, and then we take a break for a few weeks in the middle while we do the leadership series, and then we'll have, I think, 3 more at the end. So for those of you who may not know me for some reason, I'm Andrew Pierce. I'm your lab manager. So we're going to talk about interviewing and observation techniques today. And so this is really valuable twice sort of in the design cycle. The first one is when you're trying to get user needs up front in the beginning of your project. So you're first starting out a project and you're trying to figure out, what are we doing? What's it supposed to do? How's it supposed to work? How does this interact with our user, whoever the end user would be? And then again, at the end, when you go to do validation and you're trying to understand your user and see if that solution that you develop for them really works for them. So, sorry, I got a leash on here. So we'll cover this mostly from that first perspective of you're at the beginning of your project, and that's why we do this early on in the semester. You're at the beginning of your project and you're trying to understand your user. So learning objectives today, one is going to be to try and understand what the purpose of an interview is. So why would you want to interview somebody and talk about your project within the context of a design project? What are some strategies that you can use when you go to do an interview? So most of you have a community partner that your team partners with. You're going to want to go out and talk with them. So today we took Indiana School for the Blind and Visually Impaired down to that namesake school, and they talk to the students, they talk to the teachers, and they try to understand what their life is like. So that's what we're about. And then we'll talk about just a little bit about, you've went and talked to someone about what they need, what they like, what they dislike. How do you turn that into user needs and specifications that you can actually use in your project, okay? So the objectives of your interview, number 1 should be to gain empathy for your user. This is especially early on in the project. So we're there to try and connect on a human level with someone, because from that empathy, when you can understand someone and put yourself in their shoes, that is where your best insights will come from for a design, okay? So you will design the best product if you're designing it for yourself. So the more you can put yourself in someone else's shoes, the better you can do at designing for them, okay? So you're also there to find out what you didn't know that you didn't know, okay? So when you start out in a project, there are a few things that you know, but there are some things that are going to surprise you, that are way outside of the bounds of what you expected to find out. And this is what you're trying to get to in that interview. And then the last sort of specific thing that you want to know is those technical details that you need for your project. And we would all, at least most of you are engineers, and you tend to think of those things first, right? So how big does it need to be? How fast does it need to be? How does it need to operate? To us, those are the first priorities. But for really good quality design, and we work in this human-centered design cycle, it's really about connecting with the user, and then all of those things will come as secondary to that. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. All right, if you're coming in just a minute late, there should be Scantron sheets back there. So you guys are all returning students. You should know this drill, but make sure you put your name, your Purdue ID, and mark number 1 is true. That's the test today. If you don't do that, you don't get credit. Make sense? It's a tough test. I'm sure the toughest one you'll have all semester. All right. I'm going backwards. So I mentioned empathy. So how many of you can tell me what empathy means? Anybody? And this is a bigger room than we usually have. Anybody want to give me a?
Putting yourself in their shoes.
Putting yourself in their shoes. So that's a great way to think of it, okay? So sympathy is this idea where you kind of feel for someone, right? So if you see someone who has broken their leg and you say, man, I feel bad for that guy, that's sympathy. Empathy is when you can put yourself into their shoes and you feel with them, okay? So empathy is the feeling that we want in design, because we want, like I said, to design for yourself is the best design you'll be. So the more you can put yourself and the person who you're designing for in a similar mindset and a similar emotional frame, the better you'll be at designing for them. So what we don't want you to do is to go to your community partner who has some problem, right? And look at them like, you're here to save the day, because in comes the design team. They're going to save the day and fix this problem for this poor person who is on the other end of the line. And this is especially easy to do whenever we have a situation where we're working on assistive technology and you're working for a child with a disability, or you're going to work in some educational system. You think these people don't know anything and I'm going to teach them, right? So we don't want to get that haughty attitude where we think, we're coming in here to save the day for you and fix your life. That's not how we want to view our users. These are our community partners, right? Not our clients or our customers, they're partners. Does that make sense to everybody? So they are there to co-design with us. So you want to sit down with your partner and say, what do you think of this? Do you think this could work? How would this solve your problems? And try and understand and build empathy with them, okay? So this is a critical point. So it's one of the most cringeworthy things that happens in EPICS projects when students come in and they have the attitude like they're here to fix something for someone else. And they view the community partner as a small person that has big problems instead of a person who has lots of expertise. Because no one knows more about how to design something for them than they do, right? So you want to come into them and try and understand their specific viewpoints, try and gain from their experience with the problem that you're working on. Because you probably don't have any experience with the problem that they have, but they do. They've been living with it, right? So that's some of the difference between empathy and sympathy. So please, shedding a little bit of light on that, keep that in mind as you go through. So as you go in to do an interview, there's several things in your technique, but first remember it's a social human interaction, okay? So you're not doing a questionnaire in person, right? So we've all done a written questionnaire or a survey, and you go through and there's a series of answers and you answer them one at a time. That's not how you should structure your interview, right? Your interview should be free form. You should let them lead you to what's important to them. Because you may have come up with this list of 20 questions that they didn't care about, right? But they know what they do care about. They know what's important to them in the design, right? So let them lead you in the conversation and aim at connecting with them on a human level, right? So as you talk to somebody, that should be your aim. You also want to interview about the person first and about the product second. So if you leave an interview and you never talked specifically about your design product, but you really gained understanding for that person, you'll be able to come back with insights that will help you to understand them. So they may have been telling you some specific behavior, but what you're trying to get at is what's the inference? Why are they behaving that way? Why do they feel that way, right? Because that's how you can fix it. So a great example is if you went in someone's house and they said, I have this problem that I don't have enough storage, right? I've got all of this stuff, but I have nowhere to put it. And you go back and come up with this great solution that you're going to build them all these cabinets and they'll have more storage. When maybe really the problem was that they're hanging on to a bunch of stuff they don't need, right? So there's more than one angle to the problem. And if you only are interviewing them for their problem, you're there to try and get those pain points and solve their problem. You'll miss out on the broader context, what really is the root issue, okay? And the better solution would be what addresses that root issue. So a couple of things. Before you get to an interview, you want to do some preparation. And sometimes I do a good job of coaching teams in this, and sometimes I struggle. But I got some really good coaching on this from a company called Worrell, which is an industrial design firm. So we'll talk a little bit about industrial designers in one of the last lectures that we do, but they're very good at the human side of design, okay? So tend to be much better than engineers at understanding people and their problems, where engineers are often really good at understanding the mechanics behind a solution, right? But what they taught us was, one, you want to make sure that you come up with your list of questions that you have and categorize and group them and put them together in a way that makes sense to you. Because when you're in an interview, things can get really chaotic, right? You're usually in a hurry. People will give you a limited amount of time, especially if they're busy people. If people in a profession, usually you're at work, they're in a hurry and they're not going to want to sit and talk with you forever. So you want to bunch your questions together into a logical format so you don't get lost. You're also going to want to go through and identify which ones are really critical that I need to have answered for me to move forward in my design, and which ones are really just nice to know, okay? So you want to go through and make sure you indicate those in your interview guide. And again, remember, the interview guide and the questions that you ask are sort of a guideline for you as you ask questions, but you want to let that user take you on the path that they want to walk down, okay? So if you work every day with some particular problem that you need this design solution to, you have a lot of thoughts about it, and let them take you down that path, because they'll lead you to what's important, right? So maybe all those other things that to you are important might not matter to them at all. They just want it to work, and they want it to work in this way that works with them and their system. So a good example of that, we had a team a couple of years ago that was working on a ball for a physical therapist, where when a kid would kick the ball, it would measure the force. And they wanted to look at how does that force change over time as the kid goes through physical therapy, and see, are they getting better? Are they getting stronger? And the team came up with this really cool ball that had sensors in it, and then they came up with this application that would give you the data, and they had 7,000 charts and graphs and dots and lines and all of this information. And this physical therapist didn't want to mine through all of that information to try and get out what they wanted. All they wanted was one number, right? So just give me, on a scale of 1 to 10, how hard did he kick the ball? That's all they wanted to know. And so getting through to your user and understanding what is it that's really critical to them, and getting past your own preconceived notions about what this thing could do or what you think it should do, right? So just because something can have a lot of features or can do a lot of things from a technical point of view doesn't mean that those are the best things to do. When you go to actually prepare your questions, there are a number of sort of guidelines for interview questions, okay? The first and worst thing that you can do is to ask binary questions or closed questions. So you don't want to ask a question like, would you like the ball to be blue? Because then they'll say yes or no, and you didn't understand them at all, right? You didn't get anywhere with them. So maybe ask, what color would you like the ball to be? That's open-ended, but it still gives you a one-word answer, right? So maybe say something like, what kind of a feeling are you trying to achieve with this ball? So get to those more the kind of root fundamental questions. The color doesn't really matter. It's really about how does this make you feel? What kind of a mood does it convey? Something like that, right? And you'll get a lot of those things in your design. So never ask questions that don't allow for conversation, because you don't get any understanding, any empathy for your user by knowing what color they like, but you might by understanding what's the context in which you'll be using this. How does this matter to you? Does that make sense to everybody? So really getting to the human level. So the next one is avoiding conjunctions. And I've seen this on surveys a lot. It's hard for me to review people's interview questions, but in surveys saying, do you think that this would work, and when would you want it to happen? Don't ever use a conjunction in your interview questions. Ask one question at a time with an open-ended form, okay? So never string them together, try and get multiple questions, because people get confused. So a rule of thumb is your question should never be more than 10 words long. So if you ask a question more than 10 words, most people will get lost somewhere in the question, and they won't actually get to the answer, right? So make sure those questions are short and to the point, but that they give you that kind of open-ended answer so that you can build a relationship with your user. The next one, which some of you had me in the fall, we talked about this a little bit, but avoid leading questions, okay? So if you are in sales, you almost always want to ask leading questions, because you want to bias people to believing that what you made is really great, okay? But if you're in development, you really want to understand truly how your product is doing, how it works, what people really want and think, okay? So you don't want to say, don't you think it would be great if this projector could make a 3D hologram? Because they'll say, yeah, I do think that would be great, because you led them to the answer, right? Does that make sense to everybody? You see the difference? Okay. So really avoid those leading questions. Avoid bringing your user to the answer that you want them to say, because that doesn't really get you any new information, right? That you just sold them on something, but it didn't really actually build a better product. And again, like I mentioned, make sure after you get all your questions created in your interview guide, mark which ones are really required, right? So if you have a question like, you're going into a country and you don't know what the voltage of an outlet is that they can plug this thing into, you really, really need to know that answer, right? That's a technical piece that without it, you can't move forward. Make sure that you mark those things as critical, okay? And then, so you've created this interview guide, you went and met with your user, you talked with them. and I say user, but I should specify, your interview doesn't necessarily have to be with the person who will be the end user. A lot of times multiple groups will have input that is valuable to you. Okay? So I used to design knee implants and instruments, and when we would go to design a new instrument set, the first person we'd go to is the surgeon, because the surgeon uses the instruments, right? And that made sense to everybody. And we had for years gone to the surgeon and got their input. And then later on, we started to expand that, and we would go and talk to people who worked in the hospital clean room and find out how did they handle the instruments when they cleaned them. What was difficult for them to clean? What made them really happy when they cleaned it because it came together really well, right? People take pride in their jobs or in the things that they do, and so by talking with more people who interact with these things, you learn a lot more. And then we would go and interview the scrub nurses that hand the instruments to the surgeon. They usually lay out all the instruments and make sure that things are in the right order. And they had a lot of opinions on the instruments that we didn't get from the surgeons because we were only looking at that one point of view. So expand your point of view, expand the group of people who you talk to. So if you're designing for one community partner, you know that you want to talk to them, but they may serve a lot of different people, and you may want to talk to some of those people who will interact with them using your device or whatever your product might be. So you can really expand that. Or if you serve sort of a diverse group of users, so say you were developing a new smartphone, you don't want to just talk to 5 average smartphone users. You want to go and look at what is the population, what do my extreme users do? Because by designing for your extreme users, a lot of times you'll get insights that make the product a lot better for everyone, okay? So maybe I'm someone who's a business traveler and I use my phone for 15 hours a day. That's an extreme user, but you can design to that person, and then your average user will never run into those hurdles that they hit, right? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So after your interview, you're going to want to meet as a group. So if you can, when you do an interview, you should always have at least 2 people, one person who can ask questions and the other person who can take notes. It's really hard to follow a conversation with someone and build that human connection if every time they talk to you, you're looking down, right, and you're not making any eye contact, right? So if you can work in groups of 2, that's a really good way to do it. So you can either have one person who's the designated question person and one person who's writing notes, or you can skip back and forth, and that works really well too, because then you can both kind of build this group dynamic. So it's a really good idea to use a group, and as soon as you're done interviewing, you start to forget information from your interview. You start to forget that look that they gave you when you talked about something that said they really didn't like that idea, or you start to lose some bit of the data that you had, or your impressions from talking with that person. So the sooner after the interview that you can debrief, so meet together, go over your notes, see what did we see that was the same, what did you and I see that was different, because different people have different perspectives and different points of view, you'll notice different things. And then you can start to look for trends in those responses, especially once you've gotten through a couple of different people that you've interviewed, and say, what were the things that we talked about that they found that delighted them, that they really got excited about, that they seemed to have passion about, and what were the things that they didn't seem to care about? Because those things we know, if we have to make changes, it's not a major issue, right? And take those notes down, because as probably most of you know, you've inherited a project that you didn't start. And it's really hard to understand why people made the decisions they made if they don't keep good documentation, right? So I know that most of you have lived that very trouble, so please don't do that to other people. Make sure you take good notes. And then you can look through those responses for user needs and specifications. So I know that a lot of you had at least the Intro to Design lectures last semester, but some of you probably had lectures with me. Can somebody give me a definition of a user need? Right in the middle. Somebody? User need. No? There we go.
Easy to use.
Okay, easy to use could be a user need, but a definition of user need.
Something that the user needs.
Something that the user needs. So it's something that this thing should do, right? So if we're talking about a car, the user needs would be, it should be able to accelerate and decelerate, right? It should be able to steer. It should be able to hold humans in it, right? So these are the primary functions. This is what the thing is supposed to do. So as you talk to these people, you can start to understand some of those primary things it's supposed to do. Okay, so if you go to interview someone about, say, their job and they work in a cafeteria and they clean dishes and you're designing a new system for that. I'll tell you, the system needs to be able to create hot water to be able to clean this thing off. And you could say, does it really need hot water? Do you care about the heat, or do you really care about the cleanliness? And then let's step back and say, okay, it needs to be able to clean plates and bowls and spoons and cups, right? And that's the primary system. And it needs to be able to do it in a reasonable amount of time, right? So you can get to some of those user needs. And then when you want to get onto specifications, since you guys are such a responsive group, I'll just define that for you. So specifications are the quantitative measure of a user need, okay? So that's when we're going to take a user need and we're going to translate it into something that matters to you as an engineer, okay? So if I said that, you know, this table should be able to withstand the weight of a rhinoceros, right? Then I could put a number to that and put it there, okay? So that's a specification. So in the case of our dishwasher, right? So we'll say it needs to clean dishes. I could specify there should be some maximum level of particulate left over after the wash cycle. Right? I could say that there should be some germ load, that there's a maximum, it needs to be beyond that. I could set that reasonable amount of time and say it needs to be done within 60 minutes or 50 minutes, okay? So those are specifications. When you get to having a number that corresponds to your user need. And those should be testable, right? So user needs you usually test through what's called a validation. And that's when you're going to say, can the car really move a person from point A to point B, right? Where your specification test would be like, can this car go 0 to 60 in 8 minutes, right? So you could have some number that is associated with it. Does that make sense to everybody? So specifications are usually numeric. They don't always have to be. They could have some other specific criteria, but those are the things that you're going to set forward as what you as an engineer or as a designer will meet. So as you go through your, yeah.
I had a question about interviewing.
Sure.
Is recording, I don't know if it's a good idea, bad idea. I know we put pressure on people, but.
Recording is a great idea if you have the commitment to go back and review what you record. And you'll usually need a third person to do it, because unless you can set up the situation where you can put a still camera, like a camcorder on a tripod, it's really hard to talk with someone while holding a camera at them and taking notes, right? So, so that situation can be difficult, but it can also be really valuable. So we used to do this in, we do cadaver labs or in an operating room where we would bring in cameras, and as a surgeon worked, we would record what they were doing and the questions and answers we're asking them, because you would be in scrubs and covered in blood, and writing notes is hard that way, right? So, so recording was really valuable, and we would go back through those videos and say, all right, we designed this instrument that had a handle that we expected to be worked out, like, you know, picked up this way, and we noticed that the guy held it overhand. And so we'd go back and look at those kind of things and say, did we lead him to do that, or is that how most surgeons do it? And so if we had 10 different surgeons, we could look through and say, you know, these 7 hold it underhand and these 3 hold it overhand. So we need to make sure it can do either one. Because a lot of times for ergonomics, that'll be completely different, right? So if you're doing an overhand, underhand, or something different. So recording can be really valuable. Just make sure that it doesn't get in the way of your primary mission, which is to understand your user, right? Okie dokie. Does everybody understand user needs and specifications? Awesome. So another useful technique in interview and observation is to bring a prototype with you, right? So the very first time you talk with your community partner, you won't have a prototype, most likely, right? Because you don't even know what it is that they want or what you're trying to do yet. But once you get to that point in your project where you have a prototype, even if it's an extremely low fidelity prototype, so even if you go in and say you're making an app for someone and you sketch it out on paper, and you can hold it in front of them and say, touch the button that would open the menu, then you can start to understand how they function, how they think about things, okay? Because you guys are all generally in a fairly homogeneous group of age, technology, understanding, things like that. When you get out into the broader world, you'll see people who are really old like me that may not understand some of the things that you're doing. So, so it's a good idea to bring prototype with you and see how people interact with things, okay? So even if it's you know, a simple cardboard representation, paper representation, or you know, a prototype along the middle of your project, if you can bring that with you and see how did they interact with it, it'll give you a conversation point that will allow you to communicate on specific features and start to gain understanding as to how people use things, and it can be very helpful. Okay? One thing that you should always look for is any interaction with your users, what did I really not expect? Right? You'll always come out with something that you didn't expect, that really took you off guard, and you want to make sure you hold on to those things because you can gain real insights from them. And you also want to look at what things really delighted them, what things really frustrated them, and look at those emotional aspects of how they used it, okay? So, if you're an engineer at Microsoft, you probably have heard a lot about the things that frustrate people in your products. But when you can experience those things with people, you can start to understand, okay? All right. So ethnography is the study of cultures. So a lot of the times when we go in to do an interview, we'll be talking about doing a form of ethnographic research. Now this is a whole field of study on its own, and people do this for its own scientific merit. I'm not going to get into those levels. I don't understand those levels. But in the context of product design, it can be very useful. So when we talk about the study of cultures, the first thing you think about is foreign cultures, right? You think, how does someone from Africa view someone from Australia? How does someone from South America view someone who's from Asia? Things like that. That's not what we're talking about here, although that is a form of culture. But there are actually cultures all around you, nearby to you, that are completely different from you, that have nothing to do with your ethnicity or your geography. But they're actually cultures based around interests or based around occupations, okay? So if you work in the kitchen of a high-end restaurant, there is a specific culture there, right? So people work fast-paced. They may be really intense, things like that. And that culture may be completely different from your culture if you work at a coffee shop, okay? So there are cultures all around you. So again, I mentioned the example that we would go and talk to people in a hospital clean room. This was a culture that we didn't understand at all, right? So we hadn't talked to these people, and they weren't ethnically different, but they did have a different culture, right? A different group. So as we started to learn some of the specific terminology, people developed languages. So probably a lot of you have been in a situation where you were talking with people who had a lot of expertise in something, and you didn't understand what they're talking about because they developed their own language. Like when I talk to you who are electrical engineering students, I don't understand what you're talking about because you speak a different language, okay? So starting to gain those insights into your user group. So if you are designing a product for nursing mothers and you've never raised a child or been a nursing mother, you won't understand them and the things that they go through on a daily basis. But by being able to interview them and build rapport with them, you can start to understand and design for them much better, right? So, interesting example of that, I guess I talked to a student who had graduated, a male student who had graduated from Purdue and worked for Procter & Gamble, one of these big companies, and designed like tampons or something. And it was like, what a culture shock for that, mechanical engineering student, male from Purdue, to go and design feminine hygiene products, right? So, he had to be able to take himself out of his preconceived notions and his area of expertise and put himself in someone else's culture altogether. And you'd have to build empathy for people and be able to put yourself in their shoes on something that you physically are unable to put yourself in their shoes, right? So a great example there. So some methods there. Observe people in their own environment, right? In their own context. So if you observe people in your context, if you invite people into Purdue and you interview them in the lab, you're missing out on a lot because you're not seeing them work how they work, okay? So if you're on the Wabash Center Greenbush Industries team, you want to go there and talk to them in their place, okay? Where they're comfortable. Where you are comfortable doesn't do you any good. So in almost all of these situations when you're doing an interview and you really want to do better product design, you need to take yourself out of your comfort level, okay? So if you come with us to the Indiana School for the Blind and Visually Impaired, things will happen to you there that make you feel uncomfortable. They're outside of your comfort zone. But that's where you start to learn and start to make those connections to understand people, okay? So that can be true of most of our teams. Right? When we take teams down to the Indianapolis Children's Museum for the CED team, a lot of us have played with kids, we know kids, but you don't understand the level of chaos and germ mess that happens with kids until you are there with them in real time and you can see how they could destroy this exhibit that you made in 3 seconds if you don't make it really robust. And that's happened a couple of times.